Hi guys. All right, so I'm actually going to read two chapters today. So we're going to read the challenge and a squire for the sorrowful knight because they're both pretty short. So when we left off, Igraine was still in the spiky knight's camp. So she's still over there and she's still trying to get out of his tent. So when we left off, she had just, let's see, had she gotten the lid back? Oh, okay. So they had kind of talked about how they were challenging the spiky knight to the single combat. So the sorrowful knight kind of told him about the challenge. All right, next chapter, the challenge. Everyone streamed out to the moat, and Igraine let the crowd sweep her along. Not that there was anything else she could do. She clutched the dragon skin tightly in case it slipped off in the general turmoil, made her way past the shying horses, and walked through a throng of baffled soldiers who stared straight through her. When she reached the moat, she stopped behind a catapult. Rowan Heartless was only a few paces away, surrounded by his squires and looking up at the battlements of Pimpernel Castle. There stood the sorrowful knight, without his helmet on and without his shield. Bertram was peering over the wall beside him, so he had made it into the tunnel. Remember, she was wondering if Bertram was going to be able to open the stone lion's mouth, so that tells her that he made it. He was holding a horn that had been lying around gathering dust in the armory for years. That was probably what Igraine had heard in the spiky knight's tent. She would have loved to wave to the two of them, but among so many enemies, she didn't even dare to bring a hand out from under her dragon skin. "Is that one of the two mysterious knights who slipped through the guard's fingers in the wood?" Igraine heard Heartless ask. "Devil knows he doesn't look as huge and terrible as they claimed." The crowd parted behind them, and Osmond's servants put their master's armchair down beside the castellan. Water was still dripping from the red upholstery. 3 men had turned into fish, and they hauled it out of the moat. "What's all this?" asked Osmond in astonishment when he saw the sorrowful knight up on the battlements. "How did that knight get into the castle?" "He's done what we've been trying to do for days," replied Rowan Heartless, never taking his eyes off his challenger. "The guards told me about a fight on the outskirts of the forest last night. It seems that the huge stone lion there came to life and swallowed up 2 knights." Angrily, Osmond turned to his men. Have everyone who was on guard in the forest last night thrown into the enchanted moat," he ordered, "at once." The 6 guards had no time to run away. They were dragged to the moat and pushed in, and the next moment, covered in silvery scales, they were diving down among the water lilies. "Rowan Heartless, now castellan to Osmond the Greedy, hear me," the sorrowful knight called down from the battlements. "I, the sorrowful knight of the Mount of Tears, challenge you to single combat. When the sun touches the treetops of the woods, I will cross lances with you outside the walls of this castle that your rapacious army is besieging." Igraine looked around. Everyone was staring up at the strange knight who dared to challenge Osmond's invincible castellan. This was her moment. It was too far to get to the escape route along the tunnel. She decided to swim the moat. "So you want to fight me?" Rowan Heartless called up to his challenger. "Why not? This siege is very tedious and boring. I've no objection to a passage at arms with my jousting lance. And there won't be more than one unless you've learned to joust better since I last defeated you. Don't think I didn't recognize you, sorrowful knight. Why did you creep into this castle by the back door? To play nursemaid to that jug-eared, snotty-nosed beanpole of a boy and his little sister in her silly suit of armor? That horrible, horrible hedgehog! Perhaps he ought to drag him into the moat. She ought to drag him into the moat with her." Igraine was quivering with rage, but Albert had taught her how to control her anger. "Sissel, Sassel, Pimpernel, hush, raid anger, now be still," she whispered. Her heartbeat slowed down. Her head could think again. Back to the castle, Igraine, she thought, slipping past the catapult and making for the moat. "A knight does not fight with insults, Heartless," called the sorrowful knight. "I want your word of knightly honor that if I defeat you, your disgraceful master Osmond will raise the siege and leave with all his soldiers." "You have my word of honor," replied Osmond instead of his castellan, but his mocking smile said more clearly than any words that what he thought of the strange knight's chances of victory. So basically what's that saying there is that Osmond says, okay, fine, because he doesn't think that the sorrowful knight will be able to beat the castellan, of course, because he's undefeated. But we know that he's been using magic. "Very well, that's settled," Rowan Heartless called to his challenger. "But what's my reward if I defeat you? Will these badly behaved brats finally hand over the singing books?" "Never!" cried Albert, jumping up on the wall beside the sorrowful knight. "Those books have been entrusted to our family for more than 300 years. The Queen of the Wood Sprites herself gave them into our care." Keep on talking, thought Igraine. You do it brilliantly. Distract their attention just for a moment. And she jumped into the moat. Something's fallen into the water, sir, she heard one of Osmond's soldiers calling. One of you blockheads, I expect, replied Osmond without turning around. He was still looking up at Albert. Yes, you heard me, Osmond, Albert called. The wood sprites themselves made the books. Their pages would wither like autumn leaves in your greedy fingers. They'd never sing their spells for you. Never. Not if you live to be as old as our castle. So raise this stupid siege of yours. The water in the moat had no effect on Igraine. It didn't harm any member of her family. She need not fear the water snakes either, far from it. They had taught her to swim almost before she could walk, and as for her armor, the books of magic hadn't been exaggerating. It really was waterproof, but the dragon skin kept almost drifting away from her, and that made swimming hard work. So here's the moat. It's one of the water snakes at the bottom. I know, she thought. Why don't I ask the snakes for help? 2 of them were coiling past her at that very moment, but of course they didn't see her. Igraine hissed quietly, as she often did when she was feeding them, and took hold of one of the spines on its back. Hush, she whispered as the snake reared its head back in alarm and bared its fangs, hissing. It's only me, Igraine. Take me to the small gate, would you? And quick! The small gate in the castle wall, the one that Sisyphus liked to use when he went down to the moat, was only a foot or 2 above the water. Apparently, Igraine's grandmother always used to sink her jewelry in the moat when there were enemies approaching. The snake easily carried Igraine through the water, but it wasn't necessarily taking the shortest route, and she saw in alarm that some of the soldiers were looking her way. So, the books of magic will not be my reward if I win, cried Rowan Heartless. But you still say that we are to raise the siege if I am defeated? What kind of a bargain is that? Are you not said to be invincible? The sorrowful knight called back. If you are, why should the price I ask for... Let me try that again. If you are, why should the price I ask for victory concern you? And anyway, called Albert, there'll be a reward for you too. Of course, if you win, I'll turn every spear point and every sword outside this castle to pure gold. Your greedy master would like that, wouldn't he? A murmur ran through the ranks of the besiegers. Osmond frowned and whispered something to his castellan. Very well, I accept your challenge, cried the spiky knight. When the sun touches the treetops of the woods, I will meet you outside the castle, and before the sun has set, I'll have sent you tumbling in the dust. That's what you think, murmured Igraine. The snake had reached the gateway at last. It raised its head, tongue flickering, and reared up out of the water until Igraine was just outside the little gate. She quickly found a foothold on the ledge below it, and luckily she was still invisible under the soaking wet dragon skin. But when she tried to open the gate, her heart missed a beat. It was locked. It was never kept locked, thought Igraine, never. She desperately rattled the iron handle, though that didn't help at all, and finally her foot slid off the wet ledge. In alarm, she grabbed for the dragon skin, but it had already slipped off her head, and Igraine stood in front of the closed door, clinging to its handle, and watched her cover float down the moat. Look, cried one of Osmond's soldiers, pointing his lance at her. There's a knight in silver armor trying to get into the castle. The archers immediately took arrows out of their quivers. 2 soldiers drew their heavy crossbows. Now we'll see what this armor is good for, thought Igraine, as she went on shaking the handle. Stop, she heard Rowan Heartless shout. She'd have known his voice among thousands. It was as cold as mist. Don't shoot, he said. That's the little minx. Can't you see? He thrust a couple of soldiers aside with the hilt of his sword and made his way through them until he was opposite Igraine on the other side of the moat. Were you planning on going on a little outing or to run away, girl knight? Leave my sister alone, hedgehog, Albert shouted down from the wall. If you hurt a hair on her head, I'll turn you into a real hedgehog, roast you on a spit, and serve you to our cat. Heartless just cast him a scornful glance. You terrify me, you jug-eared brat, he shouted. Can't you hear my knees knocking? Once we've captured this ridiculous castle, I'll put you in a cage like a monkey and take you to Darkrock with me. An interesting idea, Albert called back, crooking 3 fingers unobtrusively and pointing them Igraine's way. The lock of the gate clicked. Once, Twice, and before Igraine could fling all the insults she had on the tip of her tongue back at the spiky knight, the gate swung open, and a gust of wind that smelled very much like Albert blew her roughly through the open door. Okay, so that's the end of that first chapter, but remember today we're going to do 2. So the next one is really short, and it's called A Squire for the Sorrowful Knight. So a squire is kind of like a helper. So a squire is kind of an assistant to the knights, or to, in this case, the sorrowful knight. My word, what a close shave, sighed Albert as he dried Igraine's wet armor in front of a magic fire. And all your cat's fault, too. He kicked up such a fuss in your room that I let him out, but father didn't want him eating any more night fish, because after all, he's planning to turn them back into men again once this stupid business is over, so I locked the gate. How was I to know you'd be coming back that way? All right, muttered Igraine, pushing a strand of dripping hair back from her forehead. No harm done. They were sitting near the main gate in one of the turrets on the battlements. Bertram and the sorrowful knight were on watch up on the wall, but at the moment all was calm outside the castle. Perhaps Osmond was tired of letting Albert make a fool of him for the time being, or alternatively, he was sitting in his tent thinking up a few brand new nasty tricks. Whatever the reason, Igraine was glad for the silence. We had a terrible fright when Bertram came back without you, said Albert, undoing a knot in the tail of one of his mice. Luckily, he remembers magic spells better than you do, and he got the stone lion to open its mouth. When we heard about the fix you were in, your friend, the sighing knight, had the idea of distracting Heartless's attention by making his challenge right away, to give you a chance to escape. And it worked. But jumping into the moat like that? Albert shook his head. You've always been so impulsive, little sister. You're right. Sighing, Igraine shook a tiny fish out of her shoe and threw it through the window and back into the moat. I'm sorry about the dragon skin. Don't worry, said Albert, blowing the magic fire out. The water snakes will fish it out. They were just imagining what their parents would turn Osmond into. Currently, Albert favored the idea of throwing him and his cast-along into the moat as a pair of particularly fat fish, and then letting Sisyphus loose on them, when the sorrowful knight hesitantly joined them. Sorry, do you hear that? There's an ice cream truck going by. Let's hope Maeve doesn't hear it. Okay, anyway. Let's see, lost my part. Yes. So the lance really was enchanted, he asked. Igraine nodded. Oh, yes, but Albert's powdered put on that green glow, so you'll have your first fair fight with him this evening, and I'm going to be your squire. Albert rolled his eyes and left them alone without another word. The sorrowful knight, however, folded his arms and looked down at the place that Osmond's men were preparing for the single combat. You would be an excellent squire, no doubt about it, he said, and I thank you with all of your heart for the offer. But a knight without honor can manage without a squire too. Truly, you have shown quite enough proof of your courage, and your brother and your parents will need you this evening. Not half as much as you will, replied Igraine, picking a few water lily petals off her armor. You can talk as much as you want. I've already made my mind up. I'm going to be your squire whether you like it or not. There's nothing you can do about it. I'll hand you your lances, catch your horse if she throws you, make sure Osmond doesn't go casting any spells, and if the spiky knight tries any nasty tricks, she added as her lips began to tremble, then I'll push him off his horse with my own hands. I will, as true as you can call me Fearless Igraine, because we're friends, aren't we? Once again, the sorrowful knight looked down at the tilting ground where he was to fight the spiky knight, and for a moment Igraine thought she saw something like a smile on his lips. Yes, we're friends, he said, and what I call you is brave Igraine, so you shall have your way. You will be squire, and I'll try to prove myself worthy of your service. Okay, super good. 2 really good chapters. The next chapter is called Final Preparations. So preparations means to prepare for something. So on this chapter, I want you actually have a couple of options on this one. I want you to think about what you were kind of picturing in your mind when Igraine was in the moat with the water snakes. And I was thinking that I think it would be really cool to do my own illustration of Igraine down in the moat with the dragon skin on and the water snakes kind of leading her to the gate. So if you would like to, this is just something if you want something fun and artistic to do today, I would love to see a video of or a picture of you doing an illustration to that chapter when Igraine was down in the moat. You can post it on here as an image if your parents can help you take a picture, or you could go on to Flipgrid and do it too. Okay, thanks for listening, guys.